Good afternoon, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Stacey Pettyjohn, the Director of the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security. I'm so pleased to be here today with my colleague, Chris Dougherty, a Senior Fellow in the Defense Program at CNAS. Chris is leading a New American Way of War project, which seeks to help to reverse the U.S.'s declining military advantage vis-a-vis China and Russia by developing new warfighting approaches and operational concepts that will enhance deterrence and enable the U.S. military to prevail in a conflict should deterrence fail. Today, we're here to discuss Chris's latest report in the series, which was just released today, More Than Half the Battle, Information and Command in a New American Way of War. I'm going to kick things off by asking Chris some questions about his report, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so using the chat function on cnas.org/live. But be sure to identify yourself because we don't accept anonymous questions. So there's Chris. Excellent. Chris, can you start things off here by explaining the reasoning behind this report and why it's so critical to develop a new American way of war?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Stacey, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. This report's really, really profoundly important to me, and I think it's potentially really important to the Department of Defense. In the 2018 National Defense Strategy, there was a couple key portions of it that I think maybe didn't get quite as much publicity as they should have. And one was the inclusion of gaining and maintaining information advantage as one of the critical missions of the Joint Force, both in peacetime competition but also in conflict. And then alongside that, which I think has gotten a little bit more publicity, is the development of a more resilient C4ISR architecture. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Pentagonese, C4ISR stands for Command, Control, Communications, Computers, Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, which is basically a very, very fancy way of saying all of the networks that gather, transmit, and process information as well as command and control instructions throughout the force. So it's a very, very complex architecture. And what the Pentagon is developing today, they're called Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or as you probably often hear it, JADC2. But really, the impetus behind this in many ways goes back to a similar briefing that we had where I sat next to former Deputy Secretary Bob Work and your former RAND colleague, Dave Ochmanek. And we talked about, why the United States loses a lot of the war games we hold. And I think, Dave said it in some pretty salty language about what happens to U.S. forces in the war games. I won't repeat that because I don't think I can get away with what Dave Ochmanek can get away with. But nevertheless, I think the point holds that we would lose these war games. And the reason that we would lose these war games is almost always the same thing. And the way the red teams go about taking apart the American way of war is almost so predictable that you could script it out at the beginning of every war game. And it always starts with attacks on the US C4ISR architecture. It starts in space, cyberspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, as well as attacks on physical locations like the combined air operations centers. And essentially the point of this is to discombobulate and confuse and disorient US forces so that any response for the initial period of war is not organized or coordinated or synchronized. And during that period, Chinese and Russian teams always make hay, right? They always grab a significant portion of their objectives. They inflict a great deal of attrition. And the US teams are always, and you've seen this in war games because we've oftentimes been in the same war games, the US team basically spends the next several turns trying to get its house in order just so that it can respond in an effective way. And usually by then, the Chinese and Russian teams are offering to off-ramp, they're offering to negotiate, like, let's end this, we don't need to go any further. And I think that was really the impetus, was how do we fix it so that when they launch those attacks, the United States isn't completely rocked onto the back foot and doesn't spend the next, 3 or 4, moves of a game, or, in reality, the next 3 or 4 weeks of a conflict, just trying to figure out what's going on.
That's great. No, we definitely see a lot of losing and a lot of lost time in the early stages due to attacks on C4ISR, as you said. So you go beyond this in your report, and you talk about how the Chinese and Russian strategies are creating a technocognitive confrontation. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and how it's different from DoD's current perspective on the China and Russia challenges?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, there's this program called Joint All Domain C2, or JADC2, and it's very much focused on building out the technical networks and back-end capabilities required to transmit data and information around the battlefield or the battle space, if you want to use that terminology. And I think that the focus, and I think probably understandably so, inside the Pentagon, which tends to think about like, can we buy a program, can we engineer it, is more on the technological aspects of this competition. I think relatively less attention has been paid to the human cognitive aspects of the competition. And really what that gets to for me is, and again, I keep going back to the war game experience, is looking at the blue commanders, especially when we started moving to remote gaming, and we could actually manipulate their ability to communicate with their subordinates or with the units sort of, their left and right. And you'd see these folks who didn't have any communications, who didn't have a good understanding of what was going on. And just the look of like befuddlement and frustration on their face was really profound. And it's a hard thing to get across, like just how difficult it would be to be a commander, like a joint force air component commander, and realize like you don't have communications with your subordinate units. You don't have a great understanding of what's happening around you. And the impact that has on your ability to understand what you're trying to do, understand what the adversary is trying to do, and make good decisions with those pieces of information. And I think that what gets lost in the discussion of Chinese and Russian attacks on C4ISR is that ultimately they're attacking those networks, but the purpose is to attack us cognitively and psychologically, right? If I don't need to attack that network, I don't have to attack that network in order to do that. The purpose is ultimately cognitive, and there's a whole host of other ways in which they're going about degrading us cognitively and psychologically, not just space, cyberspace, and electromagnetic attack, but also things like peacetime information warfare, all sorts of psychological warfare during a conflict. So there's a much broader array of things that they're doing that we as the joint force need to be able to deal with.
That's a really interesting perspective and an important one to keep in mind, because I think it is easy to fall into the trap of focusing on the technology, the solutions or the problems that stem from that. Since China and Russia are really focused on gaining an advantage in information, and it's kind of central to the theories of victory, how do we counter these actions and, per the NDS, maintain an advantage in the information domain?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a four-part thing, and I like to start. And I think any concept or operational concept has to be grounded in strategy, right? There has to be a strategic approach that you're a part of, and I derive my approach obviously from the 2018 National Defense Strategy, of which I was a participating author. But I'm trying to take it beyond that to focus specifically on information and command. But really, the purpose is ultimately to deter by denial. So to prevent attacks on allies and partners, whether that's Japan or Taiwan or in Europe on our NATO allies, through a credible ability to deny China or Russia from achieving their objectives. And as part of that, so translate that into information and command. Well, what does that mean? And to me, that means attacking their strategies. So if their strategies are predicated on gaining information superiority in what the Russians would call the initial period of war, then we have to deny them the ability to gain that superiority. The problem we face is that because we're not likely to be the ones who start a war with China or Russia, they're probably going to initiate the conflict with us. So they're going to get the first shot in all likelihood. We can't have some sort of preclusive defense in cyberspace and space and the electromagnetic spectrum. That just doesn't work. It's infeasible. Those domains tend to be fairly offensive dominant. It tends to be very hard to have anything approaching a preclusive defense. So really our focus needs to be on accepting that we're going to take that first punch, accepting that that's the reality, and operating from a posture where we can take that first punch and keep operating effectively. And I say in the paper, I talk about moving away from thinking about information dominance and thinking about degradation dominance. And what that can do strategically to China and Russia is they're very clear about this. If you read their writing, they say, we need to, in the initial period of warfare, gain information superiority against the United States and deny it to them. Otherwise, we will lose. They know that that's like the critical part of if they were going to have an offset strategy, that is their offset strategy, is offsetting our information advantage. And so they want to do that, but at the same time, they don't want to fight a huge giant war against the United States and all of our allies and partners, right? They want to keep it limited. They want to keep it local. China if they're going to fight us over Taiwan, they want to fight us over Taiwan. They don't want to fight us over Taiwan and Japan and Korea and Australia and the whole, panoply of spacefaring nations that might get damaged if China goes hammer and tongs against our space capabilities. So there's this tension there, right? They want to do something limited, but they also have to act really aggressively in information. And so if we can exploit that weakness, if we can exploit that tension there by saying, look, if you want to behave really aggressively in information, one, we can probably still operate pretty effectively even when we're degraded. And two, in order to do that, you're going to have to attack all of these things, including commercial systems and other governmental systems from other partner nations and allied nations that you don't really want to attack because you don't want them involved in this conflict. Right. And I think if we can do that in the way we posture our information systems and the way we operate them, I think we can put them into a really kind of unpleasant dilemma, which is, do I go after the United States in the information environment really, really aggressively and risk escalation or expansion of a conflict? Or do I take a hands-off approach and open myself up to the full weight of the US sort of, precision strike regime, which I know if I'm a Chinese commander, I know that that's going to end badly for me. And so you really want to put them into that sort of terrible choice. And if we can do that, I think we have a credible chance of maintaining deterrence.
That's really interesting. Create a dilemma for them instead of the reverse. Right now, what you're describing, where the U.S. forces would take a punch before and not have the initiative, is something very different from what we've seen in recent operations. We've chosen the time and place to begin them. So that will really require a pretty big mind shift and sort of cultural shift in thinking about how you're going to operate. So we've seen over the last 5 years, really just a tremendous amount of activity between China and especially Russia in the information space and with their information operations. Russia seems to be everywhere online with propaganda and disinformation, social media manipulation of elections, targeting U.S. forces overseas with disinformation stories. Given all of this, what can DoD do to try to keep pace with them?
DoD has to get in the game. And I think, in large part, this is not a place that DoD likes to be. It's not a place DoD seeks out. In the paper, I sort of refer to it as a bit of a catch-22 for DoD information operations, which is that it's not part of their core competency. It's not something that is sort of a traditional core mission of the Department of Defense. At the same time, if DoD doesn't do it, they're going to start every conflict in such an incredible information hole relative to China or relative to Russia that it's going to be difficult to dig out of. And so it doesn't matter how fancy your C4ISR architecture is, if your adversary knows before going into a conflict so much more about the environment, the people that live in it, the political proclivities of different actors in different places, and they can manipulate particular audiences using very, very targeted messages, it's very, very difficult for US forces to even get their foot in the door, right, in the information environment if they don't do it now. And so it's, starting once the conflict is inevitable or once a crisis has started is way, way, way too late. DoD has to get into this game now. And I think if you read some of the comments made by General Clark down at the SOF Industry Conference, you can see that SOCOM is already starting to think in this direction. Just how do they get into the information domain? The Air Force just recently ran a big information warfare exercise that Valerie and CNAS Defense News wrote about just today, which I think is two really great signs. But I think one of the big things from a U.S. perspective is, number one, you have to get the right authorities so that we're doing this in sort of a legally, clear way, but that also make sure that we're not stepping on the toes of other actors. So it's, we're not doing these operations in isolation in the United States. We're doing them alongside allies and partners. We need to make sure it's coordinated with them. We also need to make sure it's coordinated with other aspects of the U.S. government. And then really I don't see this as a U.S. in the lead operation. Our allies and partners on the front lines have been dealing with Russian and Chinese disinformation and propaganda for decades, centuries, in some cases millennia. They know more about this. They forget more about this over their morning cup of coffee than we will ever know. And so the real key is, how do we enable them, and how do we tie that into a broader information operations or information warfare system? And I see the United States in many ways as sort of a large systems integrator, right? We're not going to be down. We're not the subcontractor making the widget. We're behind the scenes making all the widgets work together. And I think that's a role that we are uniquely suited to play in that environment.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, you've seen DoD sort of scramble to try to catch up with the information space. All of the services are developing their various initiatives and trying to ensure that they actually incorporate information along with the other domains as a part of all domain operations, but they're still a little bit behind right now. So one of the other key factors in your report that really stood out to me, and that I think is also antithetical to current US military thinking and kind of culture, is your emphasis on the need to embrace degradation dominance as opposed to information dominance, especially in space, cyberspace, and the electromagnetic spectrum. Can you describe what you mean by degradation dominance and why it's so important?
Yeah, so degradation dominance came out of a lot of the wargaming that we had done. And, when you see the evolution of the first few moves of a game as both sides start going against each other's information and command architectures, what you see is this sort of very rapid degradation of the information environment. It affects the US forces worse, but it does affect the Chinese and Russian forces. And there are things the United States and the things that DoD can do to make that degradation worse on their side. But really what you see is a fairly chaotic environment in which it's very hard to understand exactly what's happening. Things are moving at an incredibly rapid pace. The weapons used on both sides are incredibly lethal. So you see high rates of attrition, and you'll see precision attacks on really critical nodes like many of our war games, Chinese forces have launched long-range missile attacks on Pearl Harbor to disrupt the operations of the Indo-Pacific Command. And so what you see is incredibly chaotic and degraded and disrupted milieu, this environment where everything is just totally confused and discombobulated. And the key is which side can operate more effectively inside that confused, disrupted, discombobulated space. And can you operate well inside that chaos and impose enough chaos on your adversary that they are not capable of keeping up with you? And so rather than saying, I'm going to know all the things and I'm going to know them all faster than you and better than you, I think what really matters is, do I know enough of the things at the right time under the conditions that I expect to obtain in a conflict with you? And by that, I mean, I'm not going to have access to all my exquisite space assets. I'm not going to have access potentially to GPS. I'm not going to have access to reach back access to the combatant command because that link may be cut down or degraded. I'm not going to be able to have high bandwidth, constant video to all of my subordinates. I'm going to have burst transmissions of small amounts of data. Do I know how to operate? Am I effective when that happens? Because if we are, I think it's impossible to shut down the entire electromagnetic spectrum. It's impossible to shut down all of space. When you hear about these things, coming out of war games or analyses, be very, very, very skeptical because space and the electromagnetic spectrum are very, very large places that are very difficult to shut down entirely. But with that being said, they will be heavily degraded and heavily contested. So the question is, if I can only get out a few little bits and bytes of data here and there by bouncing it off of all sorts of antennas of opportunity, can I still operate effectively? Can I command and control my forces effectively with that small set of information while I'm degraded? If you can, I think you stand a good chance of at least sustaining operations long enough to not lose, which then you can translate over time into the potential to win the conflict. But in the early days, it's really about making sure you don't catastrophically fail in information and command so that later on you can build enough combat power to win in the way that we might think of it, which is to impose sufficient costs on the adversary and to deny them from grabbing their objectives so that we can reach a point where we can negotiate from a position of strength.
That's fascinating. And again, it's so different from how we see the U.S. Joint Force operating today. You look at what was done in Iraq, where you had the Joint Task Force commander watching Predator and Reaper streams in the command post before authorizing strikes on ISIS. And the environment you're talking about is one where that type of reliable communications is not something that you can count on. So you have to figure out how to operate really differently, which will be a very big change in terms of expectations and also command and control constructs. One of the things you talk about, your solution to this a bit, is the difference between loose and tight operating paradigms. where right now the US military has a much tighter operating paradigm. It's much more rigid, and they expect to have perfect high bandwidth communications most of the time. Can you talk a little bit about how the Joint Force might need to do both and to switch between loose and tight paradigms in a conflict with China or Russia, and explain what the difference is between these two approaches?
Yeah, the loose designation came out of one of the really early war games we did on this project. It was pretty fascinating because we were describing all the things we didn't like, all the things about the current, I would call it operating paradigm, but really it's how we command, control, and communicate among forces, and all the ways in which it was brittle and didn't function under attack. And I sort of said, well, it sounds like as we're talking about one paradigm, it's very tight, where everything is linked closely together and everything is very precise and very efficient, but has to work in a very particular and prescribed way, versus a way that's much more loose, which is fluid, perhaps less efficient, perhaps less particular, less precise, but effective under really degraded operations, really degraded conditions. And so what that means, beyond that, in more specifics, is if you think about command, control, and communications today, typically those things are inherently linked. Right, so a line of command and control will go from a commander to a subordinate, and their commands, the third part of that C3, the communications will be aligned with that line of command. And so, if you want to talk to somebody who's outside that line, you're essentially going outside your chain of command, which is very, very difficult to do with great effect. And there's some places and organizations where they do that fairly regularly. In a sort of past life, I was a radio telephone operator, although it's a kind of an anachronistic description as a radio operator in the Ranger Regiment. And we would coordinate with joint forces like air forces and naval forces fairly frequently, but that's relatively rare inside the joint force on a regular basis. Generally speaking, you're going up and down inside your chain of command. You're not really going side to side. The problem is the way that we're talking about fighting in the future is all about these side to side connections. Right? It's all about multi-domain. It's all about truly joint operations. It's about Air Force aircraft, targeting, providing targeting data to an Army artillery unit. Well, if you're going to do that, right, you have to not just provide the communications link, right? That's actually, it's a hard engineering problem, but from a military perspective, that's not really all that difficult. But it's really, really hard to change the command and control paradigm so that Air Force aircraft that is not in the chain of command of that Army unit can immediately task it to do a fire mission based on Air Force targeting data. And I think that's where we were getting into this in the discussion about tight loose, is that is a more loose operational paradigm. You have to be able to tolerate a little bit of a different kind of control organization than we do today, which is straight top down. So we saw one that was much more peer-to-peer, was much more ad hoc based on who had situational awareness, based on who had more information about the battle space. You could task dynamically across the sort of tactical edge of forces. And in addition to that, you have to change some of how you're doing things like targeting. So to your point, right, part of the reason that commander in Iraq is staring at that Predator and that Reaper drone is because we have very, very, very tight requirements for exactly like the precision of an attack, who that person was, multiple different intelligences, all fused and like for weeks potentially, so you knew exactly who that person is and where they were going to be at a particular moment in time. And then you took an incredibly precise strike to take them out. That's just not going to be how combat with China or Russia looks at all, right? It's going to be large numbers of maneuver forces, heavily defended by air defenses, by electronic warfare jammers, a whole host of things, right? There's going to be a lot more mass, and there's going to be a lot less precision in some of these cases, because you're just going to be desperate to get enough weapons into a particular box in order to hit enough targets. Well, in that environment, I may not need all those weapons to be perfectly precise, right? I just need to get a lot of stuff into a general vicinity, right? Again, that's loose, right? I don't need to spend 40 days building an intelligence picture. I just need to find out, hey, there's a bunch of bad stuff and it's in this area. And so I need to put a bunch of dual purpose, improved conventional munitions into that area and then destroy all of them. And again, it's a different paradigm. It's a different way of thinking than what we've become accustomed to, certainly in the last 30 years, which is this very incredibly exquisite targeting process. I just don't think we're gonna have time to do that. And so if you look at all of that kind of in totality, from the communications, the different command and control architectures, to the targeting, you start to get a sort of really different way of like the operations are gonna look quite different. And I think As we go increasingly toward unmanned and autonomous systems, that's going to become even more the case, right? It's going to be even more that you're going to have to let them do their thing the way they do it, because micromanaging them will take up too much of your cognitive bandwidth. And I think that goes back to another point that I make in the paper, which is we actually have to do mission command in the Joint Force. We talk a big game about it. We really mean it's like right there, in all the joint pubs, right? It's like right at the top, like mission command is how we, do command and control in the Joint Force. And if you ask anybody who has spent any time operating overseas for the last 30 years, they will say, with the very few exceptions, and the two communities that are the big exceptions are the special operations community and the submariner community. But basically everybody else is like, look, I had a commander from 10,000 miles in the rear on my, like right over my back, watching me with either a video feed or telling me exactly what to do. We cannot operate that way. We have to break that paradigm. If we're going to red flag and other kinds of exercises and doing it that way, we are doing it wrong, because we will get completely destroyed as soon as those comm links go down.
Yeah, the scale and the capabilities that the adversaries pose in these conflicts that you're examining in terms of thinking about having to fight a great power competitor are so different from the counterinsurgency or counterterrorism wars that we've been fighting in the past. But these changes to have this sort of loose operating structure that you're talking about is something that will require a lot of changes to potentially our organizational constructs, to authorities. When I did some wargaming on multi-domain operations, we clean sheeted it and came up with very different wiring diagrams than what you see today. And also to how you train. And I know as a part of A New American Way of War broader project, we're kicking off a deep dive into the types of training that the Joint Force is going to need to be prepared for future conflicts, because it's such an important topic and a recommendation that flows from this report. Can you touch on some of the organizational and training changes that you think will be needed to implement this vision?
Yeah, sure. So again, I keep coming back to the examples from the war games. One of the ones that stood out was once we started going to virtual games, which I actually have to say was like one of the really interesting positive side benefits of this whole COVID-19 situation, was really getting good at doing virtual gaming, because it allows you, as I mentioned previously, to really precisely control what players and what folks inside the game can see and how they can communicate with one another. And what we found was that as communications degraded, joint units stopped fighting jointly, right? So they might have started out with sort of this coordinated, maybe perhaps even synchronized set of operations, but really what ended up happening was that they would all retreat into themselves and fight as a unit. So the Navy units would fight the Navy fight, the Air Forces would fight the air fight, the ground forces would fight the ground fight. And this whole notion of like multi-domain synergy just totally went out the window. What that told me was that if we don't train people and organize them together into multi-domain units, or if you want to use multi-domain, or if like me, you just sort of think it's the next evolution of joint operations, if we don't do that, as soon as the communications links that we rely on to share information and develop a common picture of the environment go away, or as soon as they get degraded, those units will fall back on what they know. They will fall back on their training, and their training is Army training or Navy training or Air Force training. They will work with what they are familiar with. And so unless we change the way we operate, change the way we organize, and what I mean by that is we have to get away from training as individual service units, shipping out into a combatant command theater, and then glomming together at the last second into a joint task force, right? That's like the wrong answer, right? We need to get better at training together early. Well, what that means also is that organizationally, you might want to develop standing joint units that exist as sort of standing entities rather than joint task forces. And you would put, and the vision I had was that you'd have at least one major joint combat unit in both EUCOM and INDOPACOM. Obviously, with composition and leadership, differentiate a little bit. EUCOM would obviously be more Army heavy. INDOPACOM would be more naval heavy. But these would become sort of standing, not task forces, but standing forces, joint or multi-domain or whatever we want to call them, that operate together, that train together, that live together, that are accustomed to operating together, so that when push comes to shove and the communications go down and they retreat into what they know is each other. What they know is how to operate jointly in multi-domain fundamentally. It's not something that we sort of like baked in at the last minute, but it's baked into the process of developing these forces. And that goes back again into the training piece, which is if you're going to fight one way, you've got to organize and train that way. So if we plan to fight more multi-domain, if we plan to fight more dispersed in all the ways we're talking about, and I think our war game suggests that that's a good direction to go, you've got to organize for it, and then you have to train for it. And the training piece, I think, is really interesting because one of the underappreciated aspects, and Bob Work has talked about this a lot when he talks about second offset, but one of the underappreciated aspects of the second offset and of the reforms that sort of came along with that was the revolution in training that happened from the 1970s into the early 1980s. And I think we're seeing the aging out of a lot of that stuff. So I know the Army is getting rid of the military integrated laser engagement system, or MILES, which we all used when I was a private, where you go pew pew and the laser comes out and hits the other guy. But it sounds silly now, but it was a really profoundly revolutionary training tool in the 70s and 80s, and it really changed our ability to train for high-end warfare against the Soviets. And I think we have to think in the same terms when we think about fighting against China and Russia. But that training cannot be just an Army unit training with other Army units until the very, very last second, right before we all deploy, and then it's like, oh, howdy, like you're the Air Force unit that I'm going to be working with. Like that's just not how it's going to work. They should be doing unit workups way, way earlier together. And again, I keep coming back to this. This is how SOCOM has operated for decades. And I think there's a lot of lessons that the rest of the general purpose forces can learn from that, about that sort of habitual training together leads to better outcomes in combat together.
So before I ask you one last question that I have right now, I'm going to encourage the audience to keep posing questions because I'm going to turn to them soon. But this last one's a little bit different. And your report's a bit unusual compared to normal policy papers because it incorporates some fictional vignettes in it. So I wanted to ask you what the inspiration for these vignettes was and why you actually included them in a policy report.
Yeah, I don't exactly know when it happened. A lot of this report was written sort of during the sort of dark days of the early pandemic when we were all locked down, and so there's a lot of stuff that's a little bit hazy in my memory banks. But really, for me, it came out of trying to convey to a very general audience what it means cognitively for a commander in these fights or in these war games to lose their ability to understand what's going on, to lose their ability to understand what the adversary is doing, how their own forces are oriented, to not be able to communicate, and to not have access to all of these technological things that we've all become reliant on. And it's not just in the military, right? I mean, obviously, I said to somebody the other day, can you imagine doing research without Google? Like, imagine looking something up without Google. And I'm old enough to remember doing things like going to card catalogs, back in the library, way back when we were rubbing sticks together to make fire. But nevertheless, like, that level of the way that we've integrated technology into our cognitive processes is difficult to extricate back out again. But if an adversary attacks those technological systems and says, okay, now, you don't have access to GPS, you don't have access to all your fancy drones, and you don't have access to your communications networks, what are you going to do now? It's a profoundly disorienting feeling. And I wanted to put the reader inside that so they could understand really kind of the techno-cognitive confrontation, so both the two sides, but also the potential solutions and how those might work. Because one of the things that I've heard over and over and over again in discussions with people on the Hill and sort of, people who are adjacent to defense but aren't sort of defense, wonks, is what on earth is this JADC2 thing and how does this work? And I don't get this, and what's the story? And I was trying to tell the story from a human perspective in a way that I thought people might glom onto a little bit better than sort of reading out the technological specifications of a particular network gateway.
That's great. I mean, as we both have a lot of experience with wargaming, that scenarios are really important there, and the sort of story living experience. And I think the narrative part of it is a great communications device as well, and it helps people to better understand sometimes really abstract concepts that are otherwise relayed in pretty dry ways. So that's something fun that I encourage everybody to look out for in the report. I'm going to dive into the audience questions now. First one is from William. And he asked, how do you think about degradation dominance applying to adversary use of WMD against US forces?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, I think it's not all that different from how I would think about it in terms of the information and command stuff that I showed it. And really what it's about is about demonstrating an ability to operate under WMD. And we used to do this fairly regularly. I think we still do it fairly regularly in U.S. Forces Korea, where there is sort of a persistent WMD threat. And I know we're casting way back in time, but people forget that when we went into Iraq in 2003, everybody was wearing most of their MOP gear in anticipation of chemical attacks. You don't do that if you're trying to demonstrate to the adversary, like, you can do this, but it's not going to work, right? You can try to slow me down, and you might, right? It's going to be a pain to operate. I mean, getting into MOP gear is very difficult. It's annoying. It's hot. It slows you down. It's terrible to be in. But if you can do it and you demonstrate that ability, you say to the adversary, look, this isn't worth it, right? Because what you're going to do is you're going to potentially prompt a massive escalation in this conflict, and you're not really going to slow me down all that much.
Okay, the next question is from Patrick, and he is asking you to expand a little bit on autonomous or AI-assisted systems, which can make decisions on their own without communicating or receiving orders from command. Are they a part of your idea? If so, what kind of actions would you have them make?
So I'm chuckling to myself because there's a section of the paper I cut out. So the paper's already pretty long, and I cut probably a good 35 pages of it to get it to where it is. And there was a section in there that I had written called Auftragstaktik for autonomy. For those who are not familiar with the German, Auftragstaktik is the German writing for mission command. But I use it because in German, it has a different connotation than just mission command. It's more about a philosophy of command than it is just like, here's how we issue orders. And I think that connotation is really important because that philosophy is going to apply really heavily, I think, to how we operate artificially intelligent and autonomous systems in the future. And the example I use in that little piece, which I actually might turn into a standalone article, was about the difference between the original AlphaGo bot that played Go and then the second iteration of it that called AlphaGo Zero. The difference was they trained AlphaGo against humans. So its frame of reference for understanding what to do in the game of Go was based on playing against very, very experienced humans, and it developed its machine learning techniques that way. AlphaGo Zero, by contrast, never played against humans. It only played against itself and other bots. And it developed methods of playing Go that people described as like alien. They were so outside the box of what traditional Go playing looked like that like people who are experts in Go were like, I just don't even understand what this robot's doing. And I think that is really fascinating when it comes to warfare, because do we want to create autonomous systems and then box them into doing things just like humans in a very particular and prescribed way? Or do we want to give them a little bit of trust, the way Auftragstaktik would suggest you should, and enable them to operate perhaps a little differently, but more innovatively inside sort of probably obviously, a legally and morally bounded space. But I think there's an argument there for that, because unless we do that, I think we actually will not derive the full benefit of autonomous or artificially intelligent systems. Now, the interesting question there too, I think, is I don't know. A lot of people will say, well, China and Russia might be willing to do, all sorts of things with artificially intelligent systems that we wouldn't. I don't know that that's something where they would go. Both China and Russia's philosophy of command and control is much more tightly controlled than ours. China's even more so than Russia's, but both have a long-standing tradition of sort of tightly centralized control, and subordinates have very, very little leeway to kind of deviate from orders. So I do think that might be a place where, like, we might actually have a systemic advantage if we're willing to take advantage of it.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. You hear the reverse more often, that we're at a disadvantage. But I guess our willingness to trust our people, we'd have to learn to trust our robots and our technology, and figure out how to do so in a legal and moral way, which our colleague and boss, Paul Shari, knows a lot more about. So I want to ask you one question about JADC2, our favorite acronym of the day. There's going to be a strategy release soon related to this, and we hear about different initiatives all the time. When you compare how you have approached and thought about command and control, and in particular, the lessons you learned in doing the research and that you relay in your report, how does JADC2 stack up against it? And what do you think about where the department is right now?
That's a good question. I think that there is a lot of good inside JADC2. I think the vision that they're working from is a really compelling one. I think they may need to make it a little bit more realistic. I think getting away from saying things like connect every sensor to every shooter. I know that sounds really good. It looks really good on a PowerPoint slide. I think in combat, that's just a fool's errand. I don't think you're ever going to be able to connect every sensor to every shooter in a combat situation, and I'm questionable that you should even try. But I do think that a lot of what they're talking about from a technological perspective is pretty interesting, right? So the idea of having large numbers of open systems architectures and building sort of these translating gateways so that, if you're operating a radio that is of a different generation or a different waveform than mine, we can talk to each other through a gateway, that we don't need to buy like one common set of radios for everybody, so everybody can talk and everybody's fully interoperable. That we're gonna rely on translation functions, because one of the points, we found this back when the DoD was trying to do the Joint Tactical Radio System, or JTRS, was that you're always going to have legacy systems in the pipeline. There's no world in which you realize the fully new objective force. Everybody's got the new widget, right? It's kind of like how, Apple with the iPhone, like there's people out there who still have like iPhone 5s and iPhone 6s and iPhone SEs. Not everybody immediately, as soon as the iPhone 12 comes out, goes out and like grabs the iPhone 12 and has it. And then you write all your software for that. So you have to create a system that is capable of integrating all of those old things, within reason, obviously, but you still have to do that. And then it has to be able to translate across different waveforms, depending if you're really going to operate multi-domain. So different services in different environments tend to like different kinds of radios. Air Force is very much ultra high frequency, or UHF. Ground forces tend to be much more VHF. And maritime forces tend to use high frequency, or HF, much more frequently because of its ability to transmit over very, very long ranges. And all three kind of use UHF to communicate on satellites, although to varying degrees. But each of those, again, is a different frequency, oftentimes a different waveforms. You're going to have an ability to translate those back and forth. So that is all to the good. I think that's great. The question I have with with JADC2 and a lot of the sub initiatives, whether it's Project Convergence or Project Overmatch, and even the name of Project Overmatch, you can tell like already kind of has me like a little bit concerned, is I see all these tech demonstrations and they're great and they're interesting. I just wonder how much they're thinking about bringing adversary thinking into it and adversary attacks into it, right? I'm much less interested in, we went out into an open field and we showed that we could communicate from this thing to a drone to this other thing. I'm much more interested in, we went into a field, we brought in some experts in Russian electronic warfare, and they brought in a jammer and they tried to jam they try to jam all our communications, and we could still get enough data through to execute the strike. That's interesting, right? Just doing a tech demo to say we did it in sort of an uncontested space probably isn't worth. I mean, I know that as like part of a crawl, walk, run phase, you've got to do that, but ultimately, like that's where the rubber meets the road. It's not in bench tech specs. It's in how does this thing work in realistic combat environments.
That's absolutely true. I still keep coming back to, I think one of the biggest points that I take away from your report is just sort of this tension between enhancing connectivity and breaking down barriers, and then at the same time being able to operate in looser formations and in ways that is unexpected, and where you have to expect that you are not going to have all of those connections that you'd ideally like to. And that's going to be that's a big challenge in many ways, to start to figure out how you do that technically, and then how you actually train and operate that way practically. We have a question from Mark, who says that he fully supports putting back combat back into the geographic combatant commands by refocusing them on warfighting vice diplomacy. How much pushback do you envision from the State Department and USAID to this sort of realignment?
That's a really interesting question. It's not something I thought about all that much, but just based on sort of my understanding is I would imagine that they might actually welcome some of that. They might welcome a sort of return to state-led diplomacy, which is how it's supposed to be by statute and sort of by practice, and oftentimes has not been over the last 30 years, as the geographic combatant commands have essentially become sort of military ambassadors plenipotentiary to regions. So I think actually from that perspective, that might be all to the good. Now, I think the question you probably are asking that's below that is, what about resourcing? And will they do things like, providing security to USAID projects and all these kinds of things? And I think, that's another question. But I do think, and if we're reading the tea leaves from the Biden administration, I think this is how they're thinking about it, right? I think they really want to put State Department back in the lead when it comes to diplomacy, and sort of pull back DoD and have it focus more on its traditional warfighting responsibilities. But really, I mean, I made that comment in the paper to be somewhat provocative, and so hopefully it will provoke folks, because I think I recall, and Stacey, you probably do as well. 2014 and 2015, as the threat from Russia started ramping up, just how completely unprepared U.S. EUCOM was to even think about warfare. They'd been a sort of a diplomacy and transportation command for almost 30 years, and they just really had stopped doing any thinking on military strategy or operational concepts inside their theater. Just like it wasn't their jam anymore. And so as they ramped that up, you could see just this huge process of developing that muscle all over again. And I think when you take that and you expand it, right, there's only so much time in a day, and there's only so many things you can be good at. I think the job of the geographic combatant commanders should be good at fighting wars. If you do some military diplomacy alongside that, that's okay. But fundamentally, your job is to be the commander when the United States goes to war in your theater. And that should be like the overriding priority.
I think you're right that seems to be the direction that the Biden administration is going in with respect to that. And I do recall with EUCOM, and at that point they were drawing down forces and had really sort of shifted to focus on security cooperation. What a big shift it was to begin to think about having to deter a major conflict in theater instead of serving as an expeditionary force that was going to the Middle East or Africa Exactly. Yeah. So that's an interesting one. It does seem we return to the point again that competition is a whole of government, and something that other agencies and departments probably should be leading, and DoD focuses on the deterrence and warfighting piece of it. There's a question from Tom about deepfakes technology, and if it becomes prevalent both domestically and on the battlefield, how would you mitigate the effects of that cognitively?
So a lot of these things really come down to trust. A lot of this cognitive aspect and the technocognitive confrontation and mission command, all these things, they really come down to trust. Do you trust your commanders? Do you trust your subordinates? Do you trust people to your left and right? Do you trust the information that you're seeing? Do you trust your systems? And China and Russia really want to make you not trust them. So even if they can't break it, they want to make it. And the Russians in particular talk about this a lot. The Chinese are much more likely to want to break your systems, at least in their writing, whereas the Russians really want to get inside your systems and use it to mess with your head. And so we definitely saw this, in one of the games we ran looking at a Taiwan conflict. The Chinese red team made all these deep fakes, basically showing the president of Taiwan and the military chief of staff surrendering essentially, and they were broadcasting this all over the place. And you're right, how does that cognitively, if you're a subordinate commander on the beach, in Taiwan, and you see this coming over, on your phone or what have you, are you like, man, am I going to go out and stick my face in the wood chipper when back in the rear, they might be giving up? Or, so I think there's a lot to be unpacked there. And I think that's actually, frankly, something that we should dive into in our training paper that's coming up next, which is specifically how do you prepare the force for that? But I think the first step is the first step is admitting you have a problem. The first step here is admitting that we have a problem as a society, and as the military reflects society as a military, in sifting through information and parsing out what is true and what is not true, and separating information from disinformation and misinformation. And I think it requires both education and then specific training. Education to develop the cognitive skills and the critical thinking skills to say, that looks fishy. Or I don't, that's a really oddly timed. It's really odd that all of a sudden they just got up and made this video that looks really slickly produced. And then I think the second part of it is training once you go into a particular theater, right? So because there's this sort of education, like I'm laying the baseline that you can understand this, and the next piece is, okay, you're going up against the Russians, you're going to go deploy the Baltics. Here are the very specific ways in which Russia talks about implementing reflexive control, which is their idea of psychological and cognitive manipulation. And so, or you do something different. You talk about 3 warfares if you went into Indo-PACOM. But I do think that really needs to be a part of the pre-deployment workup for any unit that's going to those areas. It's like, this is how they're going to do this. They're going to attack your Facebook page and your Instagram feed and your Twitter feed. And they're going to, this is what they're going to do. And they're going to they're going to send weird text messages to your wife, which is like another thing they've been doing, if the Russians been doing to folks deploying the Baltics. So there's all sorts of like really crazy stuff that they can do and that they are doing. And that's another point that I really would like to folks to take away from today, which is like, this isn't something that's like far off in the future, and this is 2030 or 2045, and maybe if we go to war with China or Russia, like this stuff is happening today. China and Russia are doing this stuff right now. They see this as the sort of slow motion boil for how they achieve their objectives, right? This is core to it. And so they are trying both to achieve their objectives without fighting if they can, but if not, they're trying to set the environment in the information environment, set the information environment so much to their advantage that if war does happen, the United States just like doesn't have a prayer. And it's happening today. Like the technocognitive confrontation is going on right now. It's not something that's like happening at some other point in time.
Absolutely true. You mentioned a little bit earlier about Russia and China's sort of command and control constructs, and that they tend to like to have tighter control because and why they might not be willing to provide as much autonomy to robotic systems or AI and trust machines. Did you look any more at sort of their command and control constructs and how that's tied to their approaches to warfighting?
Yeah, we did. And we actually ran sort of alongside this project, adjacent to it, but not of it, another project that looked exactly at that question, which was sort of a comparative wargaming series looking at US versus Chinese command and control. And recognizing sort of like the difficulty with that is that, like, we're a bunch of Americans trying to act, we had obviously, China experts, but ultimately like they can't be of the PLA. They're still Americans fundamentally, cognitively, and socially. But nevertheless, the best we could replicate it. It's a very different way of thinking about command and control than we do. Although I'll be honest, a lot of the way I think China operates is more like how we actually operate, vice how we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves that we delegate authority. We tell ourselves that we entrust our subordinates. But I actually think it's much more rare in practice than it should be. I think we do a lot more mother may I type of management than we do in micromanagement than we actually do mission command, much to our detriment. So we talk a big game about it. We don't do it, but at least we talk about it. You don't really see them talk about it at all in the PLA. It's much more directive, and it's much more tied to the party, which is, I think, a critical point that people oftentimes forget. Is the PLA is not it's not the PRC's army. It's the CCP's army. I think it's a really important point because that means they have political commissars and political officers way down into very low tactical echelons, making sure that, and they are actually part of the chain of command. They have this kind of odd bifurcation of command in the PLA between the political commissar and then the actual sort of PLA commander. They both share command, and the way it happens in practices is oftentimes different depending on the unit, depending on the people involved. But generally speaking, like that's one way in which the party exerts direct control over tactical military operations, is through that use of these political commissars and political officers, which again is very different. On the Russian side, they don't do that as much anymore, even though the Soviets very much had their political commissars in their units. But one thing they do is they have they script their combat much more, the Russian armed forces. So they like to have, they run what they might call plays, right? So they might have like, this is battlefield play 1, battlefield play 2, battlefield play 3, and you're just going to train endlessly on doing those plays. And then as your commander, I'm going to call 1, and I'm going to expect you to do exactly what is in battlefield play 1. It's much more like that than sort of US where like we train to do react to contact or, certain kinds of things, but like it's not expected to be rote and mechanical once you get up to an operational level. So maybe like tactically you're supposed to, rehearse and know exactly what you're going to do. But as you span up the chain of command, it's not quite so conformist. Whereas the Russians expect people to basically do exactly what the echelon above them is telling them to do, which again, it does in theory grant US forces greater operational flexibility. The question is, are we actually going to put our money where our mouth is and really do that? I'm really heartened by the fact that General Brown, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, has put mission command and other forms of delegated authority into Air Force doctrine and Air Force thinking on command and control, because the Air Force, quite frankly, has always been the most centralized and the most controlling of the services when it comes to command and control. So I think that's a really positive development. We'll see if it actually gets implemented in practice. But I think just putting it in doctrine and saying, look, we're going to allow, maybe some forms of decentralized command and control inside the Air Force, not just centralized command, decentralized execution, I think is actually a really positive development. But I think we're going to need to see more of that, and it's going to need to be implemented. And people are going to need to trust their subordinates. They're going to need to take risk, right? They're going to need to be okay with their subordinates doing something that they didn't want them to do. And they're going to say, look, that can't be a sort of black mark on somebody's OER that they trusted a subordinate. That subordinate didn't behave exactly how they're supposed to. Because if that's going to be the standard, then everybody's going to tightly micromanage everything so that they can hit the next rung on the promotion schedule. And I think that's in large part, if I were to sort of hypothesize, it's one of the critical issues facing us, is that in order to maintain your sort of promotability, you have to adopt a zero risk attitude inside your command. And so you see these commanders, that's how they operate. I think the good ones can drive above that, but I think a lot of people, that's how they operate, is they micromanage everything to squeeze out the last iota of risk within their command so that they get a good OER. And I can't blame them for that. They're responding to the incentives they've been given, but I don't think that's the way we ought to train and organize our forces moving forward for the kind of combat we're going to see.
So many different cultural shifts and habits that we need to change and that are fairly ingrained. We're down to about a minute or two, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to offer some concluding remarks before we sign off.
Other than just thank you to everybody for joining today. Thank you to you for moderating the session and providing such great questions. And thanks to all the folks who asked questions in our chat. I hope everybody enjoyed it today. I would say go check out the paper, and there's also a brief op-ed in Defense News and c4isr.net about this. And be on the lookout for the next the project on a new American way of training, featuring Jenny McCardle, adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS. We're going to be starting work on that in a week. And yeah, the next big paper in the New American Way of War project will be on logistics, and that will be coming this fall.
That's great. I'm just going to echo your thanks to the audience. Thank you for tuning in. Check out the report. It's on our website, and read it. It's actually really fun. You have the vignettes and you have the substance, so there's a lot there for you to chew on. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Have a good afternoon.